Welcome to the Earth Keepers podcast. This podcast is for people who seek new and better ways to love and care for the earth. It's a podcast for anyone who is deeply concerned about the harm being done to the environment on a local and global level. It's a podcast that builds community and connection between people of like heart and mind, people who believe that earth care should be integrated into every aspect of life, and for many in the Earth Keepers community, that includes our spiritual lives. In this episode, we'll be talking to Dominic Frongillo, a young climate advocate, politician, and teacher from New York State. Dominic's story is particularly inspiring because he was the youngest person ever elected to serve on the city council in Caroline, New York, and one of the youngest deputy mayors in the U.S. He is also the co-founder and executive director of Elected Officials to Protect America, an organization whose mission it is to create a safe, prosperous, and healthy planet by supporting and mobilizing elected officials and civic leaders to protect the environment and fight climate change. In our conversation, Dominic helps us to understand that real change can happen when courageous individuals help motivate whole communities around common cause, at the local or the global level.
There are people who are the leaders, who are taking action, and by spreading those to their neighbors and their friends and their colleagues and taking courageous action and being the ones to be out front inspires other people to follow. And that's courage is contagious, and that outward expression of courage is what we call a social movement, people joining together.
Welcome, friends, to the Earth Keepers podcast. Well, Dominic, welcome to the podcast. We're thankful that you're making time for us today in your busy schedule. Could you orient our listeners to who you are and what you do day to day?
Thank you, Forrest. And it's a pleasure to be here with you, given just how much intention you have and your listeners around the world focused on how we can care for our planet. I'm a former council member, served in Caroline, New York Council for 8 years, 6 years as a deputy mayor, and grew up as a young person picking up cans and bottles in our road, picking up trash that other people threw out their car windows, and learned from a young age stewardship and really carried that forward into public service and our work now, organizing elected officials around the country on environmental justice, protecting our lands and water, protecting people and our planet, and responding to the climate emergency.
So what are the projects and organizations that are taking most of your time and energy these days?
Well, EOPA, Elected Officials to Protect America, we're a network of state and local elected officials across the country who are committed to stepping up to the climate emergency challenge and protecting our people and our planet. And that really grew out of our work serving in the town of Caroline, my hometown, where there's old timers and newcomers in the community, really bringing people together around common values of energy independence and food independence. And how can we community self-reliance, rural self-reliance in our community? And we always thought that the front lines of the climate crisis were somewhere else. They were in the Gulf of Mexico or the mountaintops of West Virginia or the tar sands of Alberta, Canada. But, we had two 100-year storms within 5 years, causing millions of dollars of public infrastructure damage. A tornado actually hit our mayor's mother's house. Fortunately, she was on the other side of the house, but it ripped the garage roof off, sprinkled insulation in the trees like confetti. So really hitting close to home. And that's what brought me to go to the UN climate negotiations, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, to represent our community on an international stage. So that's how we got started.
When you say elected officials to protect America, I'm wondering, does that include governors involved in that network?
We're a network of state and local elected officials. So mayors, city council members, we have state representatives, state senators. At our press conferences, we'd have members of Congress as well. So we really are able to align leadership from city halls to state houses to the halls of Congress.
The reason I ask is because my cousin is Jay Inslee. He's our governor here in Washington State, and obviously he's a climate monster. So he would love everything that you're doing, honestly.
Well, we're a big fan as well and appreciate his leadership. So great to see that it runs in the family.
Well, tell me, why the environment? Why climate activism in particular? What have been some of the shaping influences that have made you someone who cares about the earth?
like I said, growing up in a rural community, growing up on a dirt road, having my parents teach us the values of stewardship of our community, of our environment, learning about erosion, how we need to protect our soil from a young age was really, really influential. And my grandfather, he served in the Korean War as a tank mechanic, came back and was the first in the family to go to a semester of college, but had to drop out because he had to support 5 kids. So my father was the first in the family to graduate from college and really dedicated his life to making lives of kids better. And so really inspired by his example to make your life about something bigger and about service. So that's what led me on the path to public service, learning about traveling to Costa Rica. I lived on a farm and saw firsthand the destruction that even in a place like Costa Rica, 90% of the rainforest cut down for pineapple farms, or export. So really seeing how the interconnection of our global economy and how that has an impact on the lungs of our planet. So learning in school about green cities, the power of cities and government to be able to change things. My plan was actually not to run, but to go to the Peace Corps. And so met with the recruiter, was all set to go. And then our deputy mayor at COPE at the time said, "Hey, heard you're leaving town. That's great. Congrats. There's just one problem." It's like, "What? You can't leave. After 8 years on council, I'm retiring, and I want you to run for my seat." And, I don't know how many of your listeners are serving in office or thought of running for office, but I was like, I'm 22 years old. That's ridiculous. That's something that adults do. And then thought, well, wait a minute. Maybe I have a responsibility to give back to the community that raised me. Maybe I don't need to leave the country to serve. And so that's what set me on the path for public service, and what a ride it is and privilege it has been.
Yeah, that's a great story, especially the fact of your youth at that time. I'm really curious, probably for some people that would be a handicap, right? People might not want to trust you perhaps in terms of that much leadership, but I'm wondering, what was it about you, about your story, about your campaign that helped people to actually get behind you?
Well, as anyone who's run for office knows, that the most important thing is going door to door and having those personal conversations. So knocked on hundreds of doors, had many conversations with people, and being relatively new and humble, being, well, what would you like to see for the town? And many people had never had someone come by their door before, let alone ask them, what do you want to see for the town? And what would you like our community to be like? So took that very seriously. And I think that people really responded to the idea of representative actually representing the ideas. And we've seen that consistently with elected officials around the country who we work with, who are deeply committed to public service, say we really are here to be public servants and to serve the public. And people can really feel that.
Now, at 22, I imagine that there must have been some trepidation on your part. How did you overcome perhaps the sort of built-in suspicion of the system about young folks? Like, how did you actually decide that you could do this, that you had the chops to do the job?
Seeing my family and the courage that they had to make their life about service, there was no question. I wanted to make a difference. My mission coming out of graduating from school was very clear. I want to be a change agent, solve global problems on the local level, and be part of community. Hence the idea of joining the Peace Corps to be able to do that. And so was all ready to do service, and the idea of being able to run locally in my hometown was a different idea, but like many people, had to be asked several times. So before, like, wow, this is actually something. Can I really do this? Is this even a possibility? But looking back in high school is kind of clear, because there was a moment in high school where we got extra credit if we put Congress in action, role-playing Congress members. I was one of the only people to actually wear a suit, and took it very seriously, role-playing our moderate Republican representative at that point. So looking back, it's kind of obvious. But it seems to run in the family, as my 24-year-old cousin has run for office now as well, so representing Franklin, Massachusetts. So it does seem to run in the family.
Hey, catch us up then from that time to all the things that happened until now. Like, what developed out of that initial being in public office?
Well, again, really bringing the community together was our focus, and bringing the old timers, the newcomers together right? And around shared values. And so we named that initiative Energy Independent Caroline because it was this is a way to unite us, bring people together around this common set of values. And it really worked. I mean, we had folks that obviously they lived off the grid in homes built in the 70s. So they were completely on board with the idea with wind turbines and solar panels. We also had folks that were more on the conservative end of the spectrum and were in it for different reasons. They were tired of, one person in particular lived up on the top of Buffalo Hill Road, was not necessarily a fan, but he had solar panels on. The story was that he was so fed up with paying the utility company energy bills that he got solar panels, put them up on his trailer, and then got a flagpole, jerry-rigged a wind turbine, a little mini wind turbine, ran extension cords, Jerry chained them together, put a bunch of car batteries together in a styrofoam box, linked them together, drilled a hole in the side of his trailer, and plugged it into his fridge. And his neighbors were making fun of him for that. Like, hey, you're going green. And his response was, actually, I don't want to be supporting these corporate entities, these companies that don't really care about our community. So that's when I knew we are really onto something if we can bring people together about this idea of energy freedom, energy independence from these fossil fuels, which we know are harming our people and our planet.
Yeah, you make a really good point there about finding people, the places to connect to the issues, respecting the sort of avenues into the discussion about climate change that are maybe personal to them, maybe more relevant to them than other things. Catherine Hayhoe is someone we interviewed recently, and she makes that point that if we're going to engage in honest, open dialogue, we have to find out where the other person is coming from and respect that, not expect that they're going to come at the issues, say, of climate change, climate crisis from the same place that we are. So I think what you're talking about is really a great example of respecting that entree into the issue that this chap had.
Absolutely. And that was really inspiring too. So to be able to have that common ground was really important. And so we built on that with the idea of like, okay, after I came back from the climate negotiations in Indonesia, for me, it was really clear that the U.S. was actually one of the principal blocks of progress at the international climate talks. And so the message was very clear. You need to make change locally. And so we got together with some other young people and thought, okay, what can we do here locally using the power of local government and the power of community? So we did a distribution of energy saving light bulbs with 100 volunteers to every door in the town of Caroline in a single day. And we had people delivering it by foot, by bicycle, by hybrid car, and by horseback even. So it really was generated community attention and idea and captivated people's imagination. And talking with kids, I mean, they really got it. It was very simple. You table at the community center and you ask them, well, basically, if we could have a wind turbine or 2 or 3, that would generate enough electricity that we could actually get rid of property taxes in the town. What would you like to do with that money? And they're like, oh, I'm giving iPod to every kid at school. Like, oh, they really get it.
Yeah,
that was pretty exciting to see. And the concept really spread too, because we then took that same concept, Lighten Up Caroline, and then did that county-wide across 7 towns with 1,000 volunteers going door to door, delivering energy-saving light bulb to 15,000 households in 3 hours, the largest events of their kind in the U.S. at that point that we were aware of, that everyone used the light bulb that they got and switched that one out, it would save $1 million in energy savings. So it's pretty inspiring to see that work happen, even at the local level with Cornell Cooperative Extension and all of the community partners.
Sure. But I mean, that's so creative because on the one hand, you're actually doing something to save energy. I mean, it's literally saving energy, but you're also educating people in the process. When you talk about the totaling up of the energy saved, I mean, that's just brilliant.
Exactly. We then built on that to, okay, that's a way in. So then we trained students to do energy assessments on people's homes. And so would go around to community leaders, elected officials, professors, even state representatives saying, hey, we'd love to come in and kind of show you firsthand in your home the opportunities that you have to save energy and by extension, all of us. And there was one professor, lecturer at Cornell, was like, no, I teach this stuff. You don't need to come and do that. We're like, oh, we'd love to do it anyway. So we went in his home and actually ran the blower door test, and his rug levitated off of the floor. Because what he didn't know is there was a 6-inch gap between the addition on his kitchen and the main house. And we were able to say, imagine it in this home, if your home is like this and you're a professor and you teach this stuff, imagine how many homes around the community people have no idea. And so we showed how we were able to create literally thousands of jobs in our immediate area through home energy efficiency retrofits. So it's building this idea for, hey, energy resilience, food resilience, climate resilience. This is about investing locally, and these jobs can't be outsourced because that insulation isn't going to crawl onto the walls by itself. The solar panels aren't going to crawl onto the roofs by themselves. So we really showed the opportunity and helped build momentum for the idea of transitioning off of dirty energy to clean energy, which was really exciting to see.
Yeah. And just to clarify, the blower test, you're assume blasting air from one side of the door to see what would happen on the other side?
Yeah, so it's a giant fan that seals the door, and then air is run through, and they can measure how much air is going through, and they can measure based on the air resistance and airflow just how much is leaking through the house. So a lot of homes, particularly in the Northeast, are very leaky. So people can feel that in the winter, and that's obviously dollars going out the window.
I think you've got wisdom to share with people who are young and maybe who don't believe that they can actually make a difference, at least a significant difference. Maybe they've been told that that's the case. You obviously defied that resistance that might be on the part of society to young people making a difference. So maybe you could talk to me a bit about when you look at millennials and younger, what is their capacity for engaging issues of climate change or environmental justice?
Going to the climate negotiations was really eye-opening on that front, because there were 500 young people from around the world that were there, and hearing their stories, hearing the challenges that they face. We actually all got together on one evening and had a big event, and the members of the UK folks stood up and they're like, hey, we met with half the members of parliament and we're working on stopping coal exports. And the Australians got up and they said, actually, we went into a coal plant last month and we shut it down and walked out national heroes. And we're like, okay, don't mess with those Australians. But there was a moment where in the back, I'll never forget, a young girl named Claire stood up and said, hey, my name's Claire. I'm from the island of Kiribati in the Pacific Ocean. And my home is only a meter above sea level. And my family is so afraid because we don't know what we're going to do. We don't know where we're going to go. And she said, I feel so alone and that nobody cares. And she said, here in this room, for the first time, hearing all of you, this is the first time I feel that somebody cares and that I'm not alone. And the whole room just was moved to tears as we realized, we're part of something much larger and much more meaningful than in our own communities.
Because you mentioned Greta Thunberg and you told these stories that you experienced at this gathering, it makes me wonder if you're really onto something important here, that you're right. I believe with you that young people have enormous potential to change things. But I wonder if there isn't something very powerful about community that makes that possible. Because I do know that I look at my daughter's generation, for example, she's 19 and in college. I don't know that she would say she feels part of a community of people who care, especially on a global scale. And I'm not sure she would know how to connect if she believed that there was a community. So maybe talk a little bit about the possibilities for helping young folks to get a sense of collaboration, of belonging to this sort of same common mission to advocate for the earth. Like, what is possible there?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the most profound things that we can talk about, because the climate crisis and climate despair is so isolating, and many people feel that they're the only one that is feeling this. I mean, because you look at the news, everything is focused on things happening overseas or focused on the latest stock price, and there doesn't seem to be a sense of emergency that young people in particular are feeling. It's like, this is our future that we're growing into. but for everybody, the sense of despair can be incredibly isolating. And it was Naomi Klein that wrote in her book, This Changes Everything, that was actually one of the most radical things that we can do is to find those spaces together where we can connect and emotionally share the despair that we all feel. And she said it much more eloquently, those spaces where we can cry out together. And that's what we experienced in our town of Caroline, that when people do come together in action, we can change that despair into active hope through action by coming together and saying, hey, we together have the power to do something. And that has been so inspiring and played out when New York and the town of Caroline unexpectedly became the epicenter of one of the greatest climate fights in history.
According to Dominic and his organization, Elected Officials to Protect America, we will only be able to change the current trajectory of climate change if we take a stand with others who care, and in community, find the courage to resist environmental exploitation and injustice. And even as we create communities of people mobilized around common purpose, we might find in the process that it is the belonging to the community that helps us to support and sustain one another in our work of earthkeeping. In his new book, Do I Stay a Christian? A Guide for the Doubters, the Disappointed, and the Disillusioned, Brian McLaren writes, if you can find a community or organization that desires the good of the planet and all its creatures, the good of all people through just and generous societies, and the good of each individual, including you, with a reverence for the sacred love that flows through all these loves, that is a community in which to invest your time, intelligence, money, and energy. That is a community in which to raise your children. In the Earth Keepers community, we believe that learning to care for the planet and becoming better kin to the family of creation has everything to do with the future of the church. If you're intrigued by that idea, we invite you to join us for a free webcast with Brian McLaren, in which we'll explore themes of community, creation care, and the future of faith. We'll be gathering online on Tuesday, May 17th at 7 p.m. Pacific Time. I'll be co-hosting this event with Victoria Lewis of the Wild Church Network and Kate Davis of the Center for Transforming Engagement at the Seattle School. Again, we'll be talking to Brian about his new book, Do I Stay a Christian?, on Tuesday, May 17th, 7 p.m. Pacific Time. For more information and to register for this free event, go to the Earthkeepers website at circlewood.online. We're kind of tacking back and forth between a focus on the local and the global. When it comes to gathering people around common cause, what do you think is more important, that sense of global mission, or is it more important to focus on the folks around you in your immediate area who care?
I mean, we always thought, think globally, act locally, right? And that was an ethos that we have, that we continue to have, that we need to be able to solve these global problems with what we have, with who we are, where we are. And that's what we can. That's what we can do, and that's what we must do. And if everyone is able to do, if everyone does that, by joining together, we have way more power than we realize. And that's what we've seen working with elected officials. And we really saw that with the fracking fight in New York State. I think that's a good example of where in local communities, there was a lot of despair, not just the climate despair, but the despair of, basically, the story was, I was riding my bike to a council meeting one day, turned the corner, and what I saw absolutely shocked me. There was this convoy of giant white trucks, painted all white, no markings, out-of-state plates, driving in this massive convoy on the side of the road. It was like a military contracting convoy directly out of Iraq. Probably wasn't so far off. And they had these big discs on the bottom, and wasn't an expert on geological testing. I knew enough that they were doing some kind of seismic testing. And I just got this pit in my stomach, like very ominous feeling. What are they doing in my peaceful rural hometown? And the answer came within a year with gas leases and yellow notes saying, hey, just sign here. And within just a short amount of time, 55% of our land was leased for drilling.
Wow.
And the more our neighbors learned about it, the more they became afraid, because they started hearing horror stories over the border in Pennsylvania. Water you could light on fire, animals dying, kids getting sick and bleeding. And were just horrified in this sense, learning about this new term, hydraulic fracturing, the chemicals and the poison that is injected in the water, arsenic, toluene, benzene. Talk about despair. I had one community meeting, a mother came up to me saying, we chose Caroline to be able to raise our kids here. And in tears, she's saying, no, we have to move, and we don't know where we're going to go. And that sense of despair was palpable. People felt that there's nothing that we could do because we were told by the state, no, the town has no authority to regulate fracking or gas drilling. But there were some folks in our community that refused to give up, that said, we can't keep retreating from this industry, which is hurting people, killing our planet, that is harming our communities, harming our climate. We cannot keep retreating from the fossil fuel industry, and we need to make a stand and do whatever we can locally. So they organized a petition and started going door to door. And that small group of 7 turned into a group of 70, and they delivered a petition signed by half of all registered voters in the town of Caroline, calling on the council to ban fracking. And we had to flip the council be able to do it, and people were swept out of office that refused to act on this on a 2-to-1 margin. And we passed a moratorium, and then just in this incredible democratic outpouring. The same story was playing out in town by town, village by village, city by city across the entire state of New York. There were 200 municipalities passing bans or moratoria on fracking in New York State. It's the largest environmental movement in a generation, at least in New York State. And that sense of courage that people had, that was expressed by joining together and, hey, let's do something, created a powerful movement. And that's actually how elected officials to protect America got started, because on one hand, I'm seeing this incredible democratic outpouring from my community, just moved by people saying we have to, turning the tide on the climate emergency and this fossil fuel industry for the sake of profits, putting the future of our entire existence and our ability to survive on planet Earth in jeopardy for a few more years of profit. That has to change now. And starting in this town, in a small rural town in upstate New York, in this humble home of democracy, the resistance to this industry grew. And that, on one hand, just incredibly moving, and the other hand, learning about the climate impacts of fracking triggered something in me as a public servant. What can I do? And remembering back to my oath of office to protect the Constitution, which the preamble is very clear, is to protect the general welfare. So that was the question. What is the biggest thing I can do to protect our communities, our state? And so actually took a leave of absence from my job at Cornell Cooperative Extension, and we organized elected officials across the state on a letter to the governor saying, look, our communities are super concerned about this, and you said you would make the decision based on the facts and the science. Science isn't in yet. There's been no public health study. There's been no cumulative impact study of studied the impact of one well. What about tens of thousands? And what's the impact socioeconomically on our first responders, on the water, on tourism, on our farming industry? So we got together elected officials from all these communities across the state and launched a letter with hundreds of elected officials, and it just grew and grew and grew, and eventually to nearly 1,000 elected officials from every county in the state, bipartisan, with a single message: if fracking is not safe in one municipality, it's not safe anywhere. Mm-hmm. And we need to stand up to protect, first and foremost, the people who we represent. And to the Governor Cuomo's credit, he did do the public health study that we were calling for. And that so many grassroots folks that are mobilizing these communities now putting pressure statewide, tourism, wineries, small business owners, doctors, nurses, really incredible, outpouring young people, just incredible, and ended up doing that public health study and concluding that, fracking is actually really, really bad for both the people and the planet. And New York State became the first state in the country to ban fracking on public health grounds. And that's because a few people, town by town by town, refused to give up and decided to resist. And that courage turned into a social movement that's changed the course of history, as now jurisdictions around the world have followed New York State's lead. Germany, France, Bulgaria, Ireland, so many others, to ban fracking, and helped catalyze a movement nationally and in states around the country that, hey, this is actually a fight that we can win. We can turn the tide on this when we center this about people and protecting health and protecting people and protecting our future.
So I love the fact that you very humbly give a lot of credit to the courageous people who did all of these things. But there's a lot of courageous people. There's a lot of angry people wherever there are environmental issues. But this sort of thing doesn't always happen. And so I suspect that there were people, perhaps including yourself, who actually catalyzed that energy, catalyzed the concern, even the anger, and somehow turned it to good, right? Focused that energy, maybe even coordinated that energy in ways that could produce a movement. Is that a correct read?
Well, there's actually studies that show that 20,000 people actively participated in the anti-fracking movement in New York, and this actually speaks to a larger issue around where does change come from, right? We think of, for example, the civil rights movement, well, as Lyndon Johnson that was signing into law, and or even within the movement, we think of folks like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X that really helped attract attention and give voice to the movement. And yet there were countless people. Actually, there are studies that did count how many people, and they found something very interesting. Actually, if you look at dictatorships, obviously relevant right now, there are studies that show there's a critical threshold of number of people, percentage of people, proportion of people that are actively involved. And they found that there's been no case where a dictator has been able to stay in power if 3.5% of the population is actively on the streets, participating in the movement. It's just not possible to stay in power. And that's really inspiring because they've shown just how few people were actively participating in the civil rights movement. And yet we think of it as this movement which swept the nation. But really what it is that in communities all across the nation, there are people who are the leaders, who are taking action. And by spreading those to their neighbors and their friends and their colleagues and taking courageous action and being the ones to be out front inspires other people to follow. And that's courage is contagious. And that outward expression of courage is what we call a social movement of people joining together that can just make incredible things happen. We've seen this. I mean, basically every advance in history has become because of this. So that's why with elected officials and public servants, it's so important that we act in solidarity with communities and with those movements that are on the front lines of change, on the front lines of pollution, environmental racism, environmental injustice, and standing up to protect our people and our planet.
And so Ukraine, of course, figures into all of this, right? It figures into an example of people taking courageous action that create movements. But you also noted that fossil fuels are tied up in the complexities of the issues and even of the capacities of other nations to push back because of the dependence. But I'm wondering if you could talk just a bit about what you're doing currently to really support Ukraine and even encourage those folks who are brave enough to take a stand.
You're absolutely right. I mean, Vladimir Putin is a good example of a fossil fuel dictator. There are autocrats and dictators across the world, around the world, that main source of power is through fossil fuels. Many, many, many examples of how the centralization of wealth in this dirty money is able to sustain power. And there's no better example of that than Russia with its exports of coal, oil, and gas to Europe and around the world. I mean, 40% of Europe's gas comes from Russia. So the sales of that oil and gas directly fund Putin's war machine. And we're talking on hundreds of millions, I think it was $270 million a day that goes to Putin's war machine. So that gives us actually enormous power. And that's why we just had a press conference today with elected officials in California, including former elected who's from Ukraine, from Kiev, and calling on President Biden to declare a climate emergency, and particularly for President Biden to invoke and expand the Defense Production Act application, which is what we used in World War II to scale up the production of war materials to send to the Allies, to do the same thing now with renewable energy, to scale up the production of renewable energy, of heat pumps, of materials, and then provide them for Americans, but also overseas to help get Europe and our allies off of fossil fuels that are funding Putin's war machine. Because if we can cut that off, that is the biggest single thing that we can do to stop this war of aggression, to stop this senseless murder and occupation of this country.
Yeah, I love that point you're making because, it's sort of surreal that much of the conversation about that situation in Europe is we just have to find different sources for fossil fuels. What are we going to do? Maybe the U.S. has to send more natural gas. Not that many people are saying what you're saying is the crisis is an opportunity to actually do the conversion to green energy, to more sustainable energy. And I'm not hearing that enough. And it's just very surreal, these conversations that just talk about shifting the energy dependencies on fossil fuels to some other source rather than tackling the problem from the source, from the ground up.
Absolutely. I mean, this is industry and right-wing news talking points. Like literally, Fox News had an entire energy independence summit, they called it. And it was all about, okay, we need to ramp up oil and gas and coal production in the United States. The reality is LNG, liquefied natural gas terminal, takes years to build. And to be able to ramp that up, they're also seeing this crisis as an opportunity, the industry. And it's important for us to be able to counter with saying, well, solar panels don't take years to build. They take weeks, or they can set them up in hours. A wind turbine right now takes about 18 months. Imagine if we fully activated and dealt with this climate emergency and the global insecurity caused by fossil fuel autocrats as a national security emergency and invoke the Defense Production Act, as we're calling on President Biden to do, that we can accelerate the production much faster to just a few months, and to be able to deploy these clean energy resources to our allies, because this is a fight for our lives. For the Ukrainians, it's very visceral. People are dying on the streets right now. And for all of us, this is a preview of what's to come as the world becomes more unstable, as with refugees. This is a preview of what's to come if we do not decide to act now.
You believe in your work. You believe that change is possible. You are not one clearly who comes off into climate despair, it seems. Where's your hope and what keeps you going?
I mean, we all feel that. And I think it's important to feel the despair. To be able to move through that loss to a sense of love is what's so important for us to be able to do that together, to have those spaces together where we can join together and transform that despair into hope and into, more importantly, action, because that's when we feel that there is hope. Is if someone is taking action to make a difference, that's when we feel there is hope. That's what gives me courage, is seeing people joining together and speaking the truth, which is we need to join together to create a healthy, safe, prosperous future for all.
We've been in conversation with Dominic Frongillo, Executive Director of Elected Officials to Protect America. To learn more about his work, please check out the show notes for the episode on the Earthkeepers website. Also in the show notes, you'll find information about how you can directly support the relief effort to help people in Ukraine who have been displaced by the war. And finally, on the website, you'll find the link to register for our free webcast conversation with author Brian McLaren on May 17th. If you appreciate this podcast and want to help us expand its global reach, please share this episode with a friend. You can also show your support by subscribing. Just go to whatever platform you listen to podcasts on and hit the subscribe or follow button for the Earthkeepers podcast. Finally, it would be very helpful if you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. I'm Forrest Zinsley, your podcast host. Our executive producer is James Amadon. Our producer is Dave Ulfers. Forrest Reed is our editor and the creator of our original music. Our research assistant is Rochelle Nordman, and Jesselyn Gentry is our social media director. Thank you, friends, for listening. And please join us for our next conversation on the Earthkeepers podcast.